Hey guys, I have a little introduction here for you before we jump into our next solving method, completing the square. And so we're just going to go over some of the algebraic kind of necessities for that day to be successful next week. All right. So here we have something that's already set up in a way that we're going to kind of rig it in the future. And so to solve an equation like this, when you see this being squared, your first instinct is often to kind of expand it into a bigger quadratic. But the fact that you have a squared, you only have an x in this equation once. This is actually solvable just by square rooting, like we've been doing, okay, where you've been getting the x squared by itself. But here, instead of getting x squared by itself, I'm going to get the whole term that's being squared by itself, okay? So this is 3 times this whole thing. So to get this by itself, we can first divide both sides of our equation by 3, and that will get the part that's being squared all alone, okay? And so instead of expanding this into a quadratic, all right, think to yourself, that is actually going to make this look more complicated. I can actually now just get rid of this squaring by doing the inverse of that, the square root, undoing the square, okay? So when I take the square root of this thing that's being squared, those things cancel, and that just leaves me with the x plus 3. And the one thing you want to make sure you do not forget when you take the square root is to include this plus or minus. All right, so at this point we can evaluate the square root, or at least simplify it. In this case, though, we have the square root of 13, which does not work out nicely at all. It does not simplify, so we're going to leave it. Okay, so to get the x by itself, same thing as usual. You want to get rid of this 3. You can do that by subtracting 3. Now, these radicals don't combine with just these integers. Okay, so you have to leave them separate. And so what you probably want to do is leave the kind of integer first. So you have the negative 3, and then it's plus or minus the square root of 13. And that's a totally fine answer. So that, even though I only am circling one thing, this is 2 answers. Okay? Right, so the one answer here, because we have that plus or minus, one answer is the negative 3 plus the square root of 13, and the other answer is negative 3 minus the square root of 13. Okay? And just leaving it here is fine. It encompasses both those answers. Okay? So take this kind of process. I would pause the video now. So pause it, try these 3, okay? And then come back. And so we'll go over the answers real quick. So again, you want to get the squared by itself. So we're going to get rid of this 5. And that's going to give me x minus 1 squared equals 8. And now when I take the square root of both sides, we have x minus 1. Don't forget the plus or minus. So you have plus or minus the square root of 8. All right. Now again, we're going to simplify. How do we simplify the square root of 8? So you want to look for perfect squares that are factors of 8. So 8 is 4 times 2. So the square root of 8 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And the square root of 4 is 2. Okay, so I can simplify the square root of 8 as 2 root 2. All right? And so I can solve this for x. So I have plus or minus. This is now 2 root 2. And now to solve this for x, add 1 to both sides. Okay, the 1 doesn't combine with this 2. You don't get 3 root 2. Okay, this has a root 2 on it. This one does not, so they can't be combined. So your answer is just that 1 plus or minus 2 root 2. All right. Next one here. Get rid of the 2 in the front. So we have y plus 4 squared equals half of 18 is 9. And now when we take the square root, the squaring and the square root cancel, and you get plus or minus the square root of 9, which is 3. So y plus 4 is equal to plus or minus 3. And so when we subtract 4 from both sides, we get negative 4 plus or minus 3. So this gives us 2 answers. The negative 4 plus 3, which is 1, and the negative 4 minus 3, which is negative 7. All right, moving on here, our last one. First thing we're going to do here is divide both sides by 4. So this gives us z minus 5 squared equals half of this 16, half again is 8. And now when we take the square root of both sides, I actually have the same thing as I did over here. So the square root of 8 can be simplified as root 4 times root 2, which simplifies to 2 root 2. So this is again going to be z minus 5 equals, when I take the square root, it's plus or minus 2 root 2. Okay, so I kind of did a little shortcut there because we already had all this work over here on the left. And now I can add 5 to both sides. So z equals 5 plus or minus 2 root 2. Okay? Now, next class, when we do completing the square, this part here, the x minus 1 squared, is not going to be given to us. So you're going to have to be kind of filling that in yourself. And so the way we're going to do that is by being very good at our perfect square binomials. Okay, so the perfect square of the binomial, remember, leads to first term squared, last term squared, and then the middle term is double their product. Same thing with subtraction. The only difference is that the middle term ends up being minus. So when we have these, right, when you just have the x squared is x squared, you're going to have the middle term here, right, which is double the 3. So this is 3 times 2. And then the last term here is going to be that term squared. So you have 3 times 2 and you have 3 squared. Okay? So same idea here. With a minus 3, the last term is that minus 3 squared, which is 9. And then the middle term should be double this. So negative 3 times 2, this should be minus 6. For the minus 12, again, the middle term here is doubled. So you have negative 12 doubled is negative 24. And then negative 12 squared should give us our c value, which is 144. All right. And now we want to think about how do we do this kind of backwards. Okay. So here I have this perfect square. So remember, this middle term comes from this thing being doubled. The last term comes from this being squared. So what doubled gives me positive 10 and squared gives me positive 25. That would be positive 5. Similarly down here, what squared gives me 121, and if I double it gives me negative 22, that would be negative 11. Okay? The halving seems to be easier than the square rooting, so you can just take half of the negative 22, and then just double check, does that squared give me 121? And it does, so we're feeling pretty good. Here, what do I have to have? Okay, so I'm looking for what number doubles, gives me this blank, which I don't really have, and then what number squared gives me 225. So the square root of 225 is 15. So this 15 times 2, this will be 30. Okay? And now, on to the last one. Okay? This is really what we're going to be doing next class. The idea of how do I fill in the rest of this stuff only knowing this middle term. So if you look at all these patterns, the easiest thing to find here is actually what goes in the perfect square. And that this term doubled gives me the negative 16. So to work backwards, I can cut this in half. So half of this is going to be negative 8. So if this is negative 8, okay, x minus 8, then my last term here comes from this binomial, the second term being squared. So this is negative 8 squared, which is 64. Okay, so essentially to get to this term, I had to take half of the negative 16 and then square it. Okay, and we'll be doing much more of this in the near future. Take care. Good luck.